Everyone. I'm Chris Mandeville. I'm so glad you're joining me today for everything you need to know to write a novel. I've been writing novels for about 30 years. I've been teaching others and working with other writers and other writers groups for about 15 or so years. I love to teach. I love to meet other writers, and we help each other on our journey. It's one of the most important things to me about being a writer is that community. So I'm excited to share with you guys today what I think you need to know to write a novel. It may differ from what other folks would teach you, but I promise I will give you all the basic building blocks of novel writing. And then you can go forth and delve into them deeper on your own. We do have a handout that we'll be emailing out after the workshop that gives you an extensive 4-page list of resources for you to explore all the things we talk about in today's workshop and in the workshop we're doing the second half, which is next Saturday. There's a lot of material, and I'm only going to be hitting things on the surface level, just so you know. When you have questions, which I'm sure you will with the volume of material that we are going to go through, I would love for you to write them down, jot them down on a piece of paper, and then I will call for questions at a couple points during the workshop. Otherwise, I'm afraid if we start going down rabbit holes of questions, we might not get to everything that I want to share with you today. So that's the plan. We're going to go for 2 hours today on the first half of this workshop and hold your questions until I ask for them. All right, so I'm going to start sharing my slides here. All righty, so hopefully everybody can see my slides. The way we're going to check this is we're going to practice raising hands. So under your reactions, you should be able to raise your hand. Go ahead and raise your hand now if you can see my slides. I see lots of hands raised. So if you are unable to see the slides or unable to figure out how to raise your hand, go ahead and type in the chat and Melissa can help you out. So we should all go ahead and find the chat. I'll pull the chat up as well. So find the chat so that you're able to chat with Melissa directly or with everyone if you like. That chat is also where we're going to be having you ask your questions. And at various points, I may ask you to participate by giving me an answer to a question I ask or sharing some of your own experiences, because I want to get to know you guys too. All right, so we're going to get started here. I've already told you a little bit about myself. So let's go ahead and just proceed with the workshop if I can get to my controls here. All right, here we go. This is an overview of the things we're going to be talking about today and everything you need to know to write a novel. It's a pretty extensive list of topics. Each one of these topics could be its own multi-hour, even multi-day workshop. But as I mentioned previously, we're just going to be touching on the surface level, a brief high-level overview of each of these topics to familiarize you with the concepts without going into too great of detail. What I'm aiming for is to provide you a jumping off place so that when you reach a point in your writing where one of these tools would be valuable to you, you're aware that it exists and you can go forth and delve into it a bit deeper. As I mentioned also, we're going to be covering a whole lot of information. And because there's so much information, there's a risk that you could get overwhelmed just by the sheer volume of it. If you start to feel overwhelmed, I'd like for you to stop and remember 2 things for me. First, you already know a whole lot about writing. You might not feel like it when you are confronted with all these new concepts or concepts that may be unfamiliar to you. But even if you're new to writing stories and having these things called by these terms like point of view, you have been lifelong consumers of story through books and movies and television shows and plays. And the patterns, themes, and concepts of storytelling are already ingrained in you, in your subconscious, even if you're not aware of it. So remember that you already know a lot of what we're going to cover, even if you don't know that you know it. Second, when writing your story, Your story comes first, every time. The concepts, tools, and ideas that I'm going to present to you, and what other writing teachers will present to you, they are never more important than you telling your story. So if you're writing away someday and you hear my voice pop into your head and I say, well, what about point of view, or what about genre? I want you to ignore me, because I am not more important than your story. Nothing is more important than you getting your story on the page. So just a reminder, the material we're going to cover is meant to augment and support you as a writer. It's not ever meant to get in the way of you writing your story. Another item of business, we should have a shared definition of what a novel is, since this class is about writing novels. Dictionary.com defines it as a fictitious prose narrative of considerable length and complexity, portraying characters and usually presenting a sequential organization of action and scenes. Well, that's a whole lot of academic stuff to parse. I can break it down into two parts. It's a story. A novel is a story of a certain length. So we're going to talk about story, and then we're going to talk about word count. So what's a story? What are the required components to make something a story? Well, a story is a fiction narrative. And in order for it to be a story, it must have setting and characters. And if you don't have actual characters, something that acts as a character. And you must have plot. And plot is the things that happen. So something must happen. And it must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. If a piece of writing doesn't have all these elements, then the writing is not a story. It doesn't make it any less legitimate. It's maybe a character sketch or a scenario or an essay or a description. But in order for it to be a story, it must have these elements. And a novel is a story. The other part of that definition is it's a story of a certain length. So how long should it be? It's generally accepted that a story must be around 50,000 words or greater to be considered a novel. Now, there are famous novels that are definitely considered novels that are shorter, like The Giver by Lois Lowry, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. And there's a whole bunch of stories that are they're written for middle grade readers, younger readers that come in between 40,000 and 50,000. They're considered novels, but those are more outliers. We're going to be talking about works of fiction that have beginning, a middle, and end, and are 50,000 words or greater for the most part. Now, with our shared definitions of story and novel, we can get on to our topics. The first thing we're going to talk about today is the story idea. Now, I have never met a writer who is short of ideas. But as part of our overview, I want to at least touch on this. Story ideas can come from anywhere and everywhere. And even though there's a whole lot of types of ideas and places we can get them, we can sort of divide them into types of ideas or broad categories. Some stories come from pondering a what if question, like what if the Nazis won the war is a popular one. Other ideas can come from a character or a scenario or a plot or a setting, and some originate with a theme or a message that's important to the writer. When a story's complete, when you're done writing a story, it's going to have probably all of these things. But right now, we're not talking about components of a story. We're talking about the origin of where the story comes from. So let's look at some examples from popular fiction, stories you're probably familiar with, at least tangentially. Hook, what if Peter Pan grew up? The Bone Collector, the protagonist is this amazing character who is a paraplegic who solves violent crimes. Pretty amazing. The Matrix, based on a scenario, one might guess, our world is virtual, but the people in it don't know. The Sixth Sense, hopefully I'm not giving any spoilers away. Hopefully we all know now. The plot twist is the main character is dead, but the main character and the audience don't know for quite some time into the story. And then of course the the ultimate story of theme or message, The Wizard of Oz, There's No Place Like Home. Now, I actually don't know if these stories originated with these ideas, but it's easy to imagine that they might have. So now it's time for you guys to let me know what you are writing. Let's see a show of hands. Who here is writing a novel? If anybody here is already writing a novel, let me see in yours and a show of hands. Excellent, we have at least a few people. So for those of you who are writing a novel, or for those of you who aren't yet writing but have an idea for one, go ahead and take a second to type in the chat if you'd like to share with me where your idea came from. Writers are often asked once we're published, where did you get your ideas? So once you're published, you might want to have a prepared answer to this question. Where did you get your idea? So I'll tell you while you're typing in there, my book Seeds is a post-apocalyptic, and the idea came from an NPR story where they were talking about this thing called the Doomsday Vault, which is on one of the Svalbard Islands. And it's where, this is a real thing, where seeds from all over the world are stored there in case there's ever some sort of a catastrophe or calamity where food crops or seeds are destroyed on the earth, and they have to go get some seeds that are in this repository. So my story arose from this scenario. I wanted to write a story where getting seeds out of storage would be necessary. All right, so we have some folks who got their ideas from personal experience. Somebody wants to murder a popular minister. That's a great starting point. And of course, it's always better to murder on the page. Made up time periods, books about the Holocaust. So be prepared one day if you're published. You might be asked where those ideas came from. And if you're ever short of ideas, you can always look back at that list and say, oh yeah, I could think about what if questions, or I could think about an interesting character and jump off from there. So ideas come from lots and lots of places. The next topic on our list is genre. This refers to what type of story you're telling. Genre is a literary category. Categories in general allow people to form expectations about things without knowing a whole lot actually about them. For example, if I had a bunch of clothing here and they were divided into categories, those categories might be formal wear, business casual, sleepwear, swimwear, that sort of thing. And if I were to tell you the simple sentence, I have a box of formal wear, because I've given it that category, you're able to form some expectations about what might be in the box without me having to describe or explain it to you. It's the same way for genre categories. They allow readers to form expectations about what kind of story a novel is before they read the book. And these are things that are familiar to you: science fiction, romance, mystery, Western, humor, horror, that sort of thing. So looking at these pictures on your screen, go ahead and answer in the chat, what genres or categories do you think these fall into? Go ahead and let me know what you think. You won't be called out for any wrong answers. So while you're doing that, I'll tell you that I think Pretty Woman is a romance. We've got political fantasy, dystopian for Hunger Games. So let's talk a little bit about Pretty Woman. I would say it is a romance. If I were to tell you I'm writing a romance novel, what expectations do you have as readers about what's going to be in that novel? Go ahead and type that in the chat. What expectations do you have about a romance novel? So it's going to be about love in some capacity, right? You're not about to type it into the chat. Okay, so I think maybe somebody's thinking that there's going to be some sex in there. Oh, there might be. Romance novels have sex, but how much sex? How graphic? How much of a focal point is it going to be? Those things we don't know simply by the overall umbrella of romance. So we're not sure we want to talk about it. How do we find out what, how much sex exactly is going to be in it and how graphic it's going to be? That is where we go to subgenres. Subgenres help us to refine our expectations as readers. And Hans wrote that there's a difference between romance and romantic comedy. Yeah, I would say that romantic comedy is a subgenre of romance. And it gives you different expectations, right? When we add that word comedy. Very commonly under the romance umbrella, you'll have different levels of graphic sex, right? So you'll have a sweet romance will have less graphic sex than a steamy romance. So those subgenres become pretty important, and they don't just have to do with sex, but it can relate to profanity, violence, how graphic anything is. It can relate to the level of language and sophistication. It can relate to what somebody mentioned earlier, a happy ending. Does the story have a happily ever after, or does it leave you feeling unsettled and questioning? Then it might be literary. So genres and subgenres help us to form expectations. Another expectation that you can form as a reader based on genre and subgenre is the length of the story. So let's take a look at that. We talked about that a little bit earlier, that a novel has to be 50,000 words or more, but how long exactly should it be? And how long is too long? So keep in mind when you're looking at this list from Writer's Digest that book length can trend over time. So for a while there, young adult was trending longer. Now I think we're moving into a period in the marketplace where stories are trending shorter. And there's always going to be outliers, like The Giver by Lois Lowry. So keep in mind that this is not a hard and fast rule, but these are expectations that your readers may have about your books. So it's good to keep them in mind. So here's the biggest question about genre, and that is, why should you care? You should only care about genre as a writer if you want to sell your books. If you're simply writing for the love of writing and you don't ever plan to sell your books, maybe you'll print some out and give them to friends and family, but you're not going to sell them to the public, don't worry about genre. But if you intend to sell your work one day, understanding genre is a critical tool. So let's talk for just a quick second about selling your book. There's two ways to sell a book as a novelist. Self-publishing, where you directly sell to readers, like on Amazon or Kobo, and traditional publishing, where you sell your manuscript to a publishing house, and then that publishing house sells it to the public. We call that in the business trad. We call it indie for self-publishing and trad often for traditional. So if you're going the trad route, the way you do that is you submit your manuscript to an agent who is an intermediary between you and the publisher, or you submit directly to the publisher. And typically editors and agents, they focus on just one or a few genres, not all the genres. So you need to know what genre you're writing, so you submit it to the right people. And then once you get your work in front of the right people, your story must meet the genre expectations that that editor or agent has. Because if it doesn't, they're likely going to reject it. Well, why? Why do editors and agents care so much about genre? Well, it's because readers care. Genres and subgenres, as we mentioned before, they help readers find books they want to read. And if a reader goes to the sword and sorcery subgenre of the fantasy umbrella, if they go to that shelf, they're going to expect to see swords and or sorcery. If they don't, they're going to be disappointed, even angry. They may give you a bad review, or they may never ever buy anything you write again. That's bad for business. So editors and agents are sticklers for genre because it's a critical tool in building trust with readers and keeping those readers satisfied. So if you're going to self-publish, Finding and satisfying your readers, that's entirely up to you. You don't have this middleman of the publisher doing it for you. So it's your responsibility to know what genre to list your book under, and to make sure that once your book is listed under a particular genre and subgenre, that you're satisfying expectations, that you're meeting the reader's expectations for that genre. So bottom line is, if you're going to sell your book in any way, you should care about genre. And if you're not, then you don't care. Easy as that. So what is your genre? I wish I had a checklist I could give you so that you could easily determine what genre you're writing. First-time novelists often have a mix of genres, which makes it even harder to determine. The good news is it's pretty easy for you to figure out for your manuscript, the one that you're writing, the big umbrella genre, like romance or mystery. Then narrowing it down to the appropriate subgenre or subgenres, that's a little trickier. And the best way I know to help you do that is to say to read widely in your umbrella genre. So if you are writing mystery, then you want to make sure you read cozy mysteries and thrillers and suspense and all detective mysteries, noir, all the different subcategories that fall under the big umbrella of mystery, and start noticing what expectations you have for those various subgenres and relating that back to what you write. Which of those subgenres do you meet most of the expectations? That's probably where you fit. Now, there's lots of classes you can take and books and articles you can read about genre. There's a whole lot of information out there. When should you dig into this? If you're going to sell your book, you have two options. You can learn about genre before you write your book, research the heck out of it, make a list of the expectations, and then write to those expectations. Or you can put that aside, write the book of your heart, and then evaluate it to see where you think it belongs. And in the revision stage, do some tweaking to make sure that it really fits well into your subgenre. Either way is completely fine. There's no right or wrong answer there. Okay, so you have your idea for a novel. You may or may not know your genre. What happens next? There's no right answer, but a lot of people debate. Do you research next? Do you brainstorm? Do you outline? Do you read a bunch of stories in that genre? Do you watch movies, talk about it with others, partake in experiences that relate to your story idea? Or do you just write? Well, I think you can generally divide writers into people who do a whole lot of prep before they write and people who just sit down and write. In the business, we call those plotters, the people who prep and plan in advance, and pantsers for those people who don't plan, but instead they sit down and write by the seat of their pants. So you're not really going to find people who are 100% plotter or pantser, but knowing where you are on the spectrum can be very helpful to you. And I think the most important lesson I learned about this is that plotters and pantsers both are okay. And whichever you are is okay. It's not wrong to do the thing that comes naturally to you as a writer. You don't have to aspire to do what the other camp is doing. And it's good to know what the other camp is doing, even if you don't aspire to it, because sometimes what we're doing stops working. So if you're a pantser and you get stuck, it might help to know what those plotters are doing. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about story structure and story planning. And I do think this is good information, even for hardcore pantsers. Story structure is another one of those literary terms. It just refers to the framework of a story, the foundation on which the rest of the story is built, and it serves to hold all the different pieces of the story together. Now, if you're a plotter and a planner, story structure is fantastic because it gives you a template for planning your story. If you're a pantser, believe it or not, story structure is an integral part of your process too, but you might not realize it because it's ingrained in your subconscious from all the books you've read and all the movies you've watched. You have an understanding in your gut of what story structure is, and that guides your writing, whether you know it or not. Story structure can be a terrific tool when you're at the planning stages, if you're a planner. If you get stuck, as I mentioned, it's a great thing to look back on. And everybody should think about story structure, plotter or pantser, when you're doing revisions. We're going to look at it a little bit deeper, not too deep, but just enough to give you an idea. Like sentence structure, which may be familiar to you, story structure can be diagrammed. So here's a diagram that you might have seen. This basic triangle-shaped plot structure was first described by Aristotle. He used it to describe a story that moved along a linear path, following a chain of events, working toward a solution of a conflict. And you'll notice he's got the beginning, middle, and end. Those are our requirements. That's probably where we got it. It's from Aristotle. Now, this might look familiar to you because this is often what we learned in school. This was derived from Aristotle's triangle structure by Gustav Freytag, who was a 19th century German novelist. You don't have to remember that. He made Aristotle's model a little more complex. This is a basic map of the parts of a story. The inciting incident, which is when something happens to launch the protagonist on an adventure. There's a complication, climax, reversal, resolution, and a denouement, which of course is a good vocabulary word. Now, this diagram is another version of Freytag's pyramid that's been divided into 3 acts, with the apex or climax of that triangle being pushed over into Act 3 rather than being smack in the middle. Act 1 is the setup, where the problem is introduced to the protagonist. Act 2 is the protagonist dealing with that problem. Act 3 is the climax of dealing with that problem, conquering it, hopefully, if it's a happy ending story. And then that's followed by a resolution of the problems, all the story threads, and the denouement. 3-act structure can be broken down into more parts than 3. Shakespeare used a 5-act structure. You'll also find out there 4-act and 6-act structures, but 3-act structure is the foundation for all of these. Now, if you look at all these depictions, you'll note that they share a similarity in that the rising lines, the lines that go up, represent rising action, and the falling lines, the lines that go down, represent falling action. So rising to a climax or a peak, and then coming down the other side. This diagram more accurately depicts the type of structure we see in fiction today. In modern fiction, we no longer have the falling action be equal to the rising action. You'll see that it's not equal in length, depth, or importance. That's because we've become accustomed in modern storytelling to a very quick resolution of the story problem. So you build to a climax, and then you have a very short resolution, and sometimes a short or even non-existent denouement. That's sort of like the exhale at the end of the story. Some stories, like those by mystery writer Jonathan Kellerman, who I love, his resolutions are often so short that I'm surprised that I'm at the last page of the book. And I have to sometimes reread it a little more slowly to really get that feeling of closure. The bottom line in all of this talk about story structure is not for you to memorize the different elements, but just for you to know that story structure is a way of depicting the component parts of a story. However many parts you divide them up into, it's still story structure. And story structure can help us plan our stories, can help us make sense of a story when something goes wrong or we get stuck, and can help us hone our stories to better meet reader expectations when we get to the revision stage. So put story structure in your toolbox as something that you might use at some point in your writing. Now on to planning or plotting, whatever you might call it. We're going to define those. Story plotting or planning refers simply to figuring out in advance what's going to go in your story, what's going to happen. Technically, in terms of a literary term, plot is the sequence of events in your story. The sequence of events, that's the plot. Story planning is you as the writer figuring out some of those plots, maybe plot points, maybe a lot, or maybe just a few. When it comes to planning a story, I want to see a raise of hands. How many of you thought of writing an outline? That's often what I think of when somebody says story planning. Lots of people thought of that too. And I'm guessing a lot of you didn't think of it fondly, right? We all learned about outlining in school. For some of us, it really worked well to help us organize our thoughts and ideas, but for others, it didn't work well, or it worked, but we hated it. So I'm happy to tell you, outlining is not the only way to plan a novel. It is one way you can do it. Like if you were to Google J.K. Rowling, who wrote Harry Potter, her outline for the story, it's pretty incredible. It's out there on the internet. She shared it, which I think is awesome. It works for some people. And if it works for you and if you enjoy it, that's awesome. But I'm here to tell you there are other options for you. Now, some of these you probably came across in school along with your outlining. Maybe you came across them more recently in your kids' school work, like snowflake or fishbone diagrams. We probably had that back when I was in school, but I remember it more from when my kids were in school. Some of you may have seen some planning tools in your day jobs, like a relationship diagram or a flow chart. Sometimes we see things on television where, we have a fictitious writer's room where the writers are all sitting around and planning a story and they're storyboarding. That's what you see there with sort of the cartoon sketches. There's a whole section on your handout about methods for story planning that you can check out. I just want to give you the basic idea here that there are lots and lots of methods to help you manage your ideas, to help you put your notes in a format that makes sense to you as the master of your writing universe. There isn't any right way or any wrong way. There's only finding a way that works for you and keeping in mind that what works for you on one project may not continue to work for you on another project. So it's good to have a lot of these tools in your toolbox at the ready just in case you need them. You can also make up your own methods for organizing your material. I'm going to share with you a couple of story planning methods that I've personally found work well for me. Save the Cat, The Hero's Journey, The Plotting Grid, and Scrivener. As with everything else, I'm going to cover them pretty quickly. Again, my goal is just to familiarize you with them so that you can come back to them at some point when you might need it. Save the Cat is a book by Blake Snyder. It's also an online program at savethecat.com. This introduces a planning method for screenplay writers, but don't worry, it also works for novelists. It uses 15 beats, which are the elements that form the spine of a strong story, according to Blake Snyder. A beat in screenwriting is the smallest unit of measurement in a screenplay. So if a character sits down at a desk and picks up a pencil, that's 2 beats. So you can imagine a screenplay or a novel is going to have a whole lot of beats. This book identifies the 15 most important pivotal beats in a story. Now, I have used this for writing novels and I really like it, but my writing partner has recently started using Save the Cat Writes a Novel, in which Jessica Brody takes the Save the Cat method and applies it for us to novel writing. Both of these tools are fantastic to check out. And it really helped me after I'd been writing for more than 20 years. That's when I started using the Save the Cat method. And it was a really nice breath of fresh air. And it really gave me some new energy into my planning. Another way to story plan, one that is a staple in my writing from pretty early on in my career, it's to use a version of story structure called Mythic Structure as a template for a novel. This diagram here depicts a 3-act structure we talked about before, with the difference being here it's broken down with specific plot points related to a monomyth called the hero's journey. Now, you may have heard of the hero's journey. It comes from a very, very scholarly study by a man named Joseph Campbell. He held that numerous myths from disparate times and regions around the world, that they all share fundamental structures and stages. And he put all this study and information and his theories into a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1949, something I studied in college. Again, it's very, very scholarly. And in this book, he describes this hero's journey, and that's one of the basic patterns or monomyths found in narratives from around the world. Happens to be a pretty common monomyth in our culture here in the United States and Canada. Many, many years after Campbell's work was published, there's a man named Christopher Vogler who wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. That's his work. And he put it into a form that is really straightforward and easy to use, specifically for screenwriters and novelists. The chart here is based on Vogler's interpretation of Campbell's work. You don't have to remember all that. The important thing is that we've got this excellent template that describes many, many stories in popular culture. Star Wars, The Lion King, I mean, so many. It starts with the ordinary world. Where is the hero before the story begins? You know, Luke in his aunt uncle's farm. Then the hero has a call to adventure. Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. The hero often, but not always, refuses the call like Luke does. No, I have to stay on the farm. The hero is often, but not always, guided by a mentor who helps him to see a clear path and learn new ways of interacting with the world. Eventually, the hero jumps into from the ordinary world into the special world, crosses the threshold. If he doesn't, it's not a very interesting story. So we go on from there. He or she crosses the first threshold, goes through tests, allies, and enemies, approaches the inmost cave, on and on until he returns after conquering the big obstacle, returns to the ordinary world a changed being with new tools and lessons to share with his people. So this gives you an idea of the structure of the hero's journey. You can find it everywhere. You don't have to write it down. But there is one video I would love for you to take a look at, and it's at this link here. And it's a really interesting TED animated short from TED Talks that explains the hero's journey in an amazing way. The hero's journey is not the only monomyth journey that I want to introduce you to, though. The other one is the heroine's journey. And there's a fantastic new book for writers called The Heroine's Journey by Gail Carriger. And it is a different monomyth. And I have found that my most recent books, the young adult time travel series, they follow the heroine's journey more so than the hero's journey. Thought that was very interesting. Great new tool for my toolbox. Real quickly, here's a plotting grid. This is a photo of my actual plotting grid on a beat up old piece of poster board. I want to introduce this to you as a way of visually depicting the elements in your story planning. And whatever you use for story planning in terms of structure, whether it's your own or something that you borrow, like the hero's journey, you can use this grid or one that you make up similarly to map out those points in your story. And I do this for pretty much every novel that I write. If you want to make a grid for yourself, a physical grid in the physical world, you can go to my website, which is chrismandeville.com. And under Tools for Writers, there is a blog post describing how to make one of these grids that I find invaluable. Another tool that I use is Scrivener. That's a computer program created for writers. It's so much more than a word processing program. There's a lot of planning tools built into Scrivener. Plus, you can add templates from outside the Scrivener program, such as the ones I have listed here, you can jot down that URL if you'd like, for if you're a Scrivener user and you want some of those free templates. More information on Scrivener, go to literatureandlatte.com. I could not go back to just straight Microsoft Word or Pages now. I absolutely love using Scrivener. It also has built-in tools if you want to self-publish that make it easier for you to do so. Phew, okay, so that was a quick down and dirty with plotting tools. But I have one more I want to share with you that's really instrumental. It made a huge difference in my writing as a novelist once I learned it. Fairly straightforward and simple, but critical, called scene and sequel structure. A scene is when something happens. A sequel is when a character responds to the thing that happened. We're going to be talking about these as two separate things, scene and sequel. But they often happen in novels and movies in continuous action. So you might not have ever thought of them before as separate things because they're so connected. Something happens, your character reacts to it. A scene has three parts. Again, it's the action, something happens. The three parts are goal, your character has a goal. Conflict, something is getting in your character's way. And disaster, something terrible happens. Then we move to the reaction by your character, the sequel part. The reaction to this disaster is both emotional and in thought. So this character reaction should produce a dilemma. A dilemma is a situation with no good outcome. So at the end of the sequel, the character makes a decision about what to do next, about this crisis that's happened. Not every scene must be followed by a sequel. But you do need to have some sequels because sequels add the emotional components to your story and they keep readers emotionally connected to what's going on and emotionally connected to the characters. This is going to make more sense if you see it in action. So we're going to start with a scene from The Hunger Games. Everyone here is gathered in the town square for the annual reaping. First, the scene, remember that scene is goal, conflict, disaster. The goal is Katniss wants the reaping to be done for this year with her family and friends safe. The conflict is that Prim, her little sister, is now old enough to be included in the reaping. But surely Prim's name won't be drawn. Her name is only in the bucket one time. But disaster, Prim's name is drawn. That's the scene. In terms of scene and sequel construction, it is not the whole scene of the movie. But in terms of scene and sequel construction, that is the scene. Now the sequel, which is Katniss's reaction to this problem. Her initial reaction is she's stunned and horrified. There are no good options here. Ultimately, she realizes that she cannot let her sister die, and she must spare Prim at any cost, even if it means her own life. So she volunteers to take Prim's place. Now, keep in mind that scenes in a book are different from chapters in a book. Scenes are the building blocks of story. Chapters are the component parts of a book. Chapters don't relate to scenes one-to-one all the time. A chapter might be one scene, a scene and a sequel, a part of a scene, just a sequel, a part of a sequel, 4 scenes and 1 sequel. A chapter is not what we as novelists should be thinking in as we're writing. It can be a hard shift because as readers, we digest story in chapters. But as writers, try to become accustomed to thinking in terms of a scene. Something happens, and a sequel, your character reacts. Then later, when it comes to revision, you can think about how best to divide those scenes and sequels into chapters for your readers to digest. Because remember, you want your readers to keep turning pages. So you may not want to end a chapter with a sequel where there's a resolution to the problem, a decision about how to move forward. You might want to leave the reader hanging at the end of your chapter and have them need to turn the page to the next chapter to get that next bit of information and have that sequel resolve it. So that's for later. For now, try to think in scenes and sequels. Made a huge difference in my writing. I'm just showing you the plotting grid here again to point out that it's a great tool for planning out your scenes and sequels, either if you plan them before you write, or if you've already written them and you want to just document to make sure you've hit all the scenes and sequels you want to hit. You can use this for tracking your writing in scenes and sequels after you've already written it. Okay, so that was a whole lot of information to digest. We're going to take a couple minutes here to have you ask me questions that you've been saving up. Does anybody have any questions that you want to ask me about the stuff we've covered so quickly so far? Go ahead and type in the chat and let me know. Or if you have comments and want to share how some of this applies to your writing or your process, maybe tools that you have learned that have helped you as a writer, share those with us too. Because like I said at the outset, for me, it's about becoming a writing community and helping each other as writers, no matter where we are on the pathway to publication. I'm not seeing any questions here. Let me know you're all still out there. Can you still hear me? Okay, so I've still got an audience here from Hans. How do you classify sci-fi with philosophy as an aspect of what makes the world an imagined world? What subgenre? Sci-fi as what science did this, or the world followed a certain physics? Okay, I think I understand what you're asking, Hans. So please come back to me and let's have an interaction about this if I'm not getting it right. It sounds like you're writing something called phil-fi, or science fiction with a lot of philosophy. That is not something, even as a science fiction writer, that I am familiar with. So I'm going to kind of extrapolate here. It sounds like you have a lot of focus in your story about the origins of how things came to be, the philosophy and the physics and the science behind the world. And there could very well be books out there that focus on that. For me, as a commercial fiction writer, as a genre fiction writer, I consider those things to be world building. And a lot of those things for me happen in backstory, before page one of the novel, where we have a character with a problem who needs to take action. In my book Seeds, for example, there's a whole lot of backstory about how the world came to be in this post-apocalyptic condition. And I trickle that information into the story so that readers can digest it along with all the other components of story, all the other things they're worried about, like, is the main character going to solve their problem? What about the main character's love interest? What about their father? What about their boss? They're in trouble at work, all those other things. That doesn't mean that I didn't think about it before I started writing and plan it out and figure out exactly how the world came to be. In fact, I sat down with, on multiple occasions, a table full of physicists who helped me design this world. I said to them, I need a world that does X, Y, Z. How do I get that world? How do I create an apocalypse that's going to create those conditions? I'm seeing, Hans, that you also trickle it in. And I think that is a great way for readers to digest that information. An example of a science fiction story with a whole lot of world building and a whole lot of science behind it is The Martian. The Martian is basically a prepper book for how to survive on Mars. It gives a lot of information about how that world works. And according to my physicist husband, the writer got it right. So there's definitely room in the marketplace for books that have a lot of world building and a lot of science behind it and a lot of philosophy, to your point. It's a matter, I think, of how you present it to find the right audience. And sometimes books that are very philosophical or very thought provoking and are not plot or character driven, those are considered literary novels, even if they're science fiction or fantasy. Does that make any sense at all? Let me look back at the other comments. Maybe I totally went off track and didn't answer your question at all. Let me know, Hans. Okay, let me check and see if Hans wrote back. Biblioboard classified it as sci-fi. Well, I have to tell you, Hans, I'm going to need to look into this since I don't read philosophy oriented sci-fi. I'm really excited to learn that exists now. And I think that you should definitely listen to Biblioboard over what I'm saying off the cuff. I think that there are experts out there who know this genre better than I do. And you are probably an expert in it because I bet you read in it. So you probably have a pretty good idea about what reader expectations are there. Sorry if I didn't answer your question exactly. But I do want to take a minute we have a couple minutes here that I can go ahead and look at some of these other questions that have come in. Do different identities change heroes' journeys? Sin, can you explain what you mean by that? And while Sin is writing back,
Here, I unmuted.
Oh, hi.
Because I can't type fast enough to explain it.
No worries. I'm happy to see you. So tell me what you mean by your question.
What I mean by my question is if somebody, and I apologize if this gets a little too political for some of the others in the room, but if somebody is like LGBTQ or in a wheelchair or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Does that change their journey?
Does that change the hero's journey? Because when you were discussing the hero's journey, you brought up 3 different books. You've brought up The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, you brought up The Writer's Journey, and you brought up The Heroine's Journey. And you discussed those 3 books, although we were talking about scene and sequel, etc., in 3 very distinct ways.
Yes. So I think that the short answer to your question is yes. The character's identity, your protagonist's identity, really affects how the journey is laid out. And I think that we are guilty in modern American cinema of focusing to a great degree on the hero's journey. But the hero's journey is not the only journey. I think that the heroine's journey is a really good example of somebody putting up their hand and saying, hey, that model doesn't work for everyone. And I was raised on the hero's journey and I'm just now learning about other journeys that may be more applicable to my characters. As I mentioned with my book series, the time travel series, starting with Quake, my protagonist is a teenage girl, and she doesn't really fall into the same category or identity as the classic hero like Luke Skywalker. She has different goals. One of the specific things that I noticed is in the hero's journey, the resolution focuses on the hero as an individual, solving the problem, conquering the enemy alone. Whereas in the heroine's journey, the focus is more on working as a community, working as a group, solving a problem together so that everyone is involved in the solution and that everyone has a satisfactory ending. Those are really different ways of ending a story. And I imagine I am not part of the LGBTQ community, but I am learning more and more about that community and wanting to be more inclusive in my stories. it's a little tricky because as somebody who is not a member of a group, I have to be very careful about not appropriating someone else's story. But I do find it important to me to be aware that not everybody has the same story. And I want my books to be welcoming and inclusive to all groups. So it helps me to learn more about that. So the answer to your question is yes. I am not an authority on it, but yes, different identities have different story patterns. And you may
So
find
if I can summarize to what you just said to see if I've got it right, the trick is specificity. The hero's journey is a generality, and the trick with characters is to get as specific as possible through research, through whatever else other means, without necessarily appropriating something. Do I have that right?
yes, and I hope I answered your question adequately. That don't stop at the hero's journey. Definitely look for other patterns that might fit you and your story better. Thank you.
Then, as a quick follow-up question, does each identity or group of identities have a book? I know that seems like a silly thing to ask.
It is not a silly thing to ask. I don't know the answer to that. I would think that along with Gail Carriger's new book that just came out on the heroine's journey, that you're going to see other books come out for writers that help us to identify other monomyths than the one that is the hero's journey that's most perpetuated by Hollywood. So definitely look for those. And I will look for those too and add those to my resource list as I find them.
It's a stay tuned kind of thing. Got it.
Yes, but now I have something on my to-do list. I am going to look for other identity focused monomyths and story structures. And I do keep that list of resources up to date on my website. So the one that you'll get today in your email won't have any other identities besides hero and heroine. But I would bet then in another month, if you come back to my website, I'll have some additional resources for you.
Massive bonus points if you find the one for girls in wheelchairs. Just saying.
Well, there is a terrific series out now by Kendra Merritt, where all of her protagonists are differently abled and her main character is often in a wheelchair. And Kendra Merritt, Merritt, and she is another Colorado author. And I'll ask her if she has some resources to share with me. And if I do get an answer to that, I will be sure to share that in next Saturday's class for you. I'm going to write myself a note to ask Kendra.
Thank you so much. Sorry for, I know it's kind of a complicated question, but thanks for the extra resources and whatnot.
It's an important question, and I'm really glad you brought it up. Let's take one more minute to see if there's another question I can answer here. And I will stay after at the end of today's workshop to answer as many questions as you all have. So if I don't get to your question right now, I promise to come back to it. Okay, so this one I think I can answer quickly. Do scenes and sequels always need to have all three elements to be interesting to the reader? No. These guidelines that I'm giving you are just that. They are guidelines, they're templates, they're things that work in general. And to Sin's point, you need to make those specific to you and your character. You don't always need all 6 of those 3 scene elements and 3 sequel elements in order for it to be satisfying. Often you'll see a scene or a part of a scene back to back, a couple of them, and then a sequel. The sequel is like, a lot of times it's the internal dialogue that the protagonist is having, or in a book, and in a movie, it'll be the protagonist pondering something, thinking something, or having a conversation with a trusted ally about what they're thinking and what they're going to do next. And you don't have to have that after every single action scene. In fact, that can become a little tiring if you do that pattern over and over again exactly the same way. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up, Selena. I know there are a couple more questions here. What I'd like to do is get to those at the end. So Melissa, if you're able to capture those so that we don't lose them, I'll make sure to come back to that at the end. And now we should move on to our next section. Everybody good with that? If anybody has an urgent question, go ahead and ask me right now.
Can we answer each other's questions at some point?
In the chat?
Yes.
Yes, I would love that. Like I said before, I'm sincere about this being an interactive relationship between authors. Just because I've been writing for 30 years and you may not have been writing quite that long doesn't mean that, you know, I know more or any better than you are. I'm not here just as a teacher. I'm here as a member of the community. You all are members of the community. And so I would love it if you would interact in the chat and answer each other's questions. Might make it a little more difficult for Melissa to capture the questions for me, but I think she's up to the task. So I will get ready here to move on. Thank you so much. And I don't know how to mute you all again, so I'll leave that up to you. All right. So back to our list of topics. The next on the list is character. We've already been talking a great deal about characters. We know what characters are, right? We've been talking about how stories must have characters from one of the very first slides. We said, oh yeah, stories have to have characters. We all understand as readers and as consumers of fiction what a character is. But I want to take a look at characters from the writer's perspective, which might have a little bit of different ideas for you than you might have had as a consumer of story. So I've mentioned a couple times stories need characters, and we kind of just, you know, accepted that. But why? Why do stories need characters? We need characters because readers see the story through the character's eyes. That's even more important in modern fiction, where we have a very close perspective from which we write stories. Rarely do you get this omniscient view where there's a narrator that sees everything and knows what everybody's thinking. Nowadays, most popular fiction, you're seeing as a reader, you're seeing the story through one character's eyes. Maybe which character switches from chapter to chapter, but you're seeing it through someone's eyes. So characters enable readers to participate in the story. Readers experience what the characters experience. Readers feel what the characters feel. So it's important to have these characters as a conduit, as a way of connecting to our readers. It's all about feeling. It's characters who make readers feel. And feeling, caring about what happens next in the story, is what makes a reader keep turning pages. And that's what we all want, right? If we're going to put our books out into the public for them to read and enjoy, we're awfully disappointed if they only get 2 pages in. So we must have characters who the readers connect with in order to keep the readers engaged and turning pages. How do you create characters? This is a huge question, right? It's a question I get asked a lot at writers' conferences. How do I create a character? I don't know. We're going to spend a big chunk of time on this, but again, we're going to be moving fast. So I'll remind you to write down any questions that you may have so we can come back to them later. We're going to talk about one way of creating characters. And in talking about this method that I made up, I'm going to give you tools that you can use to create characters in your own way with whatever resonates for you. I start by dividing a character, the character building, into 2 components: the broad strokes, or sort of the big picture, and then the finer points, or the details. And I start with the broad strokes. I like to begin by thinking of a character as a type. Now, in this context, a type, even a stereotype, is not a bad thing. It's just a tool. It's a tool to help us place a character in a category that has expectations attached. Sound familiar? It's just like what we talked about with genre. Categories help humans create expectations. It's like a shortcut to a lot of information. Remember the example of formal wear. If I say, I have a box of formal wear, I don't have to spend a whole lot of time describing what's in that box. You can fill in those blanks as the reader or the listener. It's a shortcut. I use the shortcut when I start creating a character. I start with a type as sort of the canvas I'm going to work on. There's a lot of different types you can start with. Archetypes in literature are recurring character types that consistently are portrayed with a group of character traits. So we think of archetypes in older stories like the hero, the mentor, the trickster. But there are other more modern archetypes too, like the bad boy, the best friend, the free spirit. I'm not going to dig down deep into archetypes. It's a very literary thing, and I tend to not be super literary, but this is a tool I lean on occasion. And there are other ways you can explore archetypes. There's lots of resources. Here are just a few that you can go to in looking at archetypes. The Hero's Journey comes back. The book, The Writer's Journey by Vogler, does list archetypes. You can also think of it in terms of the zodiac or tarot cards, gods and goddesses, Native American totems, any number of things that are familiar to you and close to you in your life could be harboring archetypes that you could use in your writing. Next is personality types. And personality types are a psychological classification of different types of people. Now, a personality type is different from a personality trait. A personality trait refers to a smaller grouping of behavioral tendencies. Here's an example. It doesn't have to be super academic. A personality type is an extrovert. The personality traits of an extrovert might be talkative, gregarious, sociable, unrestrained, confident, feeding off being in groups. All those are traits, right? So there are a lot of different personality types that are probably familiar to you. And there are a lot of resources out there for exploring personality types. So archetypes were more literary. Personality types are more based in psychology. Myers-Briggs is probably the most common. You've probably all heard of it. If you haven't done the assessment, I haven't ever done the assessment, but I've certainly heard about it. And that's because it's really, really common, or at least it has been in past decades, in business for individuals, as a tool for individuals to get to know themselves better. There's a couple other methods that address personality type. Myers-Briggs is probably a little more scientific than, say, birth order. Oh, firstborn is always like this and secondborn is always like that. But those are of equal use to you. They could be of equal use to you as a fiction writer. As you're creating characters, you can pick any type you want. It doesn't have to be rooted in science. All it has to do is work for you to get to wrap your brain around a group of ideas that form the clay from which you're going to sculpt your character. Another type that I mentioned a moment ago is a stereotype. Now, academically, stereotypes are defined as generalizations or assumptions that people make about characteristics of all members of a group based on an image, which is often wrong, about what people in that group are like. Now, stereotypes are just oversimplifications of people in groups. It's another way of putting a bunch of stuff in a box and calling it formal wear. The validity of stereotypes is anecdotal at best. There is no scientific proof that backs up any sort of validity to stereotyping groups of people. And I think we can all agree as human beings, it's a bad idea to use stereotypes for judging people or making any sort of decisions. It's just not a good practice because it's not a valid way of characterizing people. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is using a stereotype to create the broad strokes of a character, to have a box of formalware. So you can take a stereotype, a known stereotype. We all know them from our own time in junior high to movies and books and TV shows. Stand-up comics are a good source of a stereotype information. We can take one of these stereotypes and we can use them to begin building a character. If you do choose to begin a character with a stereotype or with an archetype or a personality type or any sort of type, please don't stop there. Remember, this is just part one. This is the broad strokes. This just gives you a place to start, so it's not so overwhelming. Let's go ahead and take a look at the finer points, and that's where we get into detail. That's where we get into individuality. So we're going to take a character from broad strokes to fully fleshed out, right? We've got the skeleton of our character. Now we're going to put some flesh on it. There are lots and lots of different ways to explore putting finer points on your fictional characters. Tests, quizzes, and analysis are a great fun way to start. Like we've all seen the quizzes on the internet about, what fictional character am I? Well, you can use it the other way around. You can use those quizzes to find out more about your fictional character that you're building. The trick is to answer the questions, these quizzes, as your character. And that's a way of getting to know that character. Another way of adding detail to a fictional character is to steal details from your own life and from our friends' lives. That's something we often do as fiction writers, even if we're not doing it consciously. A really popular way to build a character is by doing a character interview or creating a character profile. Character profile is to character what outlining is to plotting, right? So it's like you fill out a whole bunch of information. And I did that with my first novel and it was very, very useful. But since then I found more fun ways to explore my character details. But again, do what works for you. Some of us are more visual, right? So a great way to visually explore what a character is like is to make a collage about that character. You can do this the old-fashioned way by cutting out pictures from magazines and gluing them onto a poster board, or you can use the more modern version and do a Pinterest board for your characters. Or you can just make up any way to explore a character. There's no wrong way here. The key two things about creating a character is to use your imagination and to make choices. This is really important. Don't be afraid to make a choice. You're not married to it. If you choose that your character's favorite color is pink, and then later you find out it would be much more useful if that character's favorite color was red, you are the master of this world and this character, and you can change it. So don't be afraid to make a choice. It is not a forever choice. Now, when you build a character, it's very natural to start with your protagonist, or if you have more than one protagonist, your main protagonist. But please don't stop there. The antagonist is the hero of his or her story too. And the antagonist should be a fully fleshed out character just as much as the protagonist. In fact, the more human your villain is, the more threatening he or she will be to your protagonist. The more characters you flesh out and explore in this way and develop in this way, the richer your story world will be, the more authentic and complex your characters will be, and the more your readers will be able to relate to and connect with the characters because they're more human. It might seem intimidating to do all this work, but let loose and have fun and play with it, and the time will fly by. I thought I'd share with you my own method that I've developed for filling in a character's details. This is a snapshot of what I call the page one character. That is what my main protagonist is like at the very beginning of the story. I start with their personal external that you see on the page there, their gender, name, age, and basic physical traits. Then I address their external world, location, their occupation, or what serves as their primary focus, where they spend their time and energy. Maybe it's not technically a job. Their family, or who serves as their family in this story, and any significant relationships they have. Then I address their internal world. This is where I list those personality traits that we talked about earlier. I pick out some favorite things like foods, colors, books, music, that sort of thing. Importantly, this is where I think about their goals and their dreams. What do they love? What do they hope for? What do they plan for? What do they want more than anything? And I also like to give them some fears and phobias. What are they most afraid of? What haunts them? What terrifies them? What holds them back? For fun, I'll show you how I built this character, Jenna McGuire. She's a character that I created for a workshop I do called Baby Got Backstory. For her external, she's female, she's 17 years old, and she's of Chinese ethnicity. She's about 5'6" and slender. She lives in our world, modern day, in the United States, on Bainbridge Island near Seattle. She lives on a farm that's not used for farming, but has plenty of space for horses. She's a senior at Bainbridge High. She lives with her mother and father, Dan and Sheila, her adoptive parents, and her sister, Julie, who is 10, and her horse, Sebastian. For her traits, she's quiet, she's introverted, she has a wicked sense of humor, but rarely shows it. And her best friend is her horse. For her favorites, her favorite color is pink, her favorite food is strawberries, her favorite restaurant is a mom and pop Greek place near her house. Her favorite movie is Secretariat. Her favorite book is Misty of Chincoteague. It does not have to be rock and science. You can make it be very obvious. In addition to going to school, she spends her time riding and grooming her horse, reading young adult novels, listening to pop music, and she loves to play chess with her dad, bake cookies with her mom, and be super goofy and sing karaoke with her little sister, Julie, though she would never, ever sing karaoke in public. For her hopes and dreams, she wants to be an equine veterinarian and to eventually have a horse rehabilitation center. So she applied to the University of California, Davis for her undergraduate degree, and she really hopes to go on to be a student in their veterinary school. For her fears and phobias, she's insecure when she is away from home and things that are familiar. And unless she's with her family or her horse, she feels pretty anxious. She fears having her heart broken, so she doesn't date at all. And her only real phobia is spiders, but she's had to get a handle on that because she can't risk spooking Sebastian, her horse, if a spider were to drop down near her in the barn. Once I have those basics down for what the character is like on page 1, I build her backstory. Backstory is everything that has happened to your character before page 1. And earlier when we were doing Q&A, I talked about backstory for world building. It is also true for your world. Everything that has led your world or your character to be what they are, the way they exist on page 1, all that is backstory. For a human being, you would think of it as my history. Here I am in front of you today. This is my page 1 character. All the things that have happened to me in my life from the day I was born that made me who I am today, that's my backstory. So I start by filling in some backstory basics, basic milestones for my character, like where was she born and where did she grow up? What sports did she play? Who was her first crush, her first kiss? What's her favorite color and why? And how do I do these things? I make them up. I just make them up. You can draw on any resource you want, or you can just ask the universe to give you an answer, whatever works for you, however it pops into your mind. I make choices. And then if something doesn't work later, I change it. So again, I'm going to emphasize, don't be afraid to make a choice. You're not committing to it forever. So here's some milestones I made up for Jenna. She was adopted from an orphanage in China when she was 9 months old. She didn't know how to crawl when she came to live with her new family in Washington State, but she learned pretty quickly. She was super shy and anxious on the first day of kindergarten, really afraid to be away from her family. Her parents enrolled her in gymnastics to help her be more confident. At age 7, she got her first passport and traveled with her mom and dad back to China, where they picked up her sister Julie, who they also adopted from China. When she was 15, her family moved from the big city of Seattle out to a tiny community on Bainbridge Island so she could have a place for a horse, and they got Sebastian. When she was 16, she got her driver's license and her very first car, which wasn't a car at all, but a beat up old pickup truck that she loves because it means she can haul hay and straw for Sebastian and she can pull his trailer. Now, at age 17, she's graduating from high school and getting ready to go away to college, but she is considering not going because she's terrified to leave her family and her horse behind. So she's considering not pursuing her most important dream. Once I've made all this stuff up, I like to track it on a timeline. If I'm writing historical fiction or other fiction that's tied to very specific dates, I put dates on the timeline. Otherwise, if the dates don't matter, I just put the character's age. Now, all that backstory I gave you, other than perhaps being adopted, most of her milestones are pretty mundane. I mean, we've all had a first day of school or a first day of something like that. We've all gone on some sort of a trip, taken a test that's important, like getting a driver's license, graduated from something. Most of us have moved at least once. These everyday occurrences do shape who we are as people. They make us who we are on our page 1 character. But what shapes us the most as human beings? What makes us grow and change? What gives us those fears and phobias and peculiarities? Trauma. That's what really shapes us as human beings. So for our characters, if we want to make them more full, real, and interesting, more human, we need to traumatize them. Now, trauma can be physical, mental, or emotional. Usually it's all of these things bundled up together. The technical psychological trauma is defined as damage to the psyche that occurs as a result of a severely distressing event. So if I asked you all to think of a traumatic event in your history, I won't ask you to share it, but I imagine there's something that popped into your mind. Something traumatic has happened to each of us. And those things shape us. Some things are more traumatic than others. Many of us have been in car accidents. I know people who have lost their homes to fires. I don't personally know anyone who's been kidnapped, but of course, we're talking fiction here. Almost all of us by this age have experienced the death of a loved one. These are things that we can draw on. And keep in mind that something doesn't have to happen to us personally, individually, for it to traumatize us, for it to affect us. Think about a terrorist act like 9/11, a global catastrophe. Maybe you weren't present during Hurricane Katrina, but it may have affected your life anyway. So think about those types of traumas. I set Jenna up on page 1 to be on the cusp of a big decision. She's been accepted to UC Davis for college, which is her dream, but she's considering not going because she is afraid to leave her horse and her family. So here's where we're going to participate in a group exercise. Try to come up with an idea about what in her past made her so afraid to leave home that she'd sacrifice her dream. And or what might have happened to her in her past that caused her to bond with her horse as her best friend rather than another human being. Go ahead and give some suggestions in the chat, please. What do you think could have traumatized her?
May I speak instead of chatting again?
Of course, then yeah, go ahead. I'm just going to open this up so I can see you all.
Okay.
Anyone who wants to talk versus type in the chat, you're more than welcome to unmute and do that. You can have your camera on if you want or not. And I'm sorry if I misidentified you. Who is speaking?
No, this is Cynthia again.
It is, okay, great.
If I may jump in terms of what may have traumatized her, right?
Yes.
From some experiences that I have with friends, being adopted internationally is no joke, even if you were adopted very young. And so that can often come with, for children, it's called reactive attachment disorder. For adults, it's called borderline personality disorder. And it just makes attachment to things very difficult. And so when you do attach to something that is safe, you grip onto it with claws, fangs, super glue, metal, acts of God, whatever you can, because attaching and detaching is just very, very difficult,
Yeah, and so apparently I either accidentally or on purpose gave Jenna a problem in her on page 1 that connects really well to the backstory that I've given her.
Yes.
And I see some other comments in the chat, and thank you so much, Sin, for that. Being bullied for looking different, experiencing racism. Those are things that we could imagine might happen to a girl who looks the way that Jenna looks, especially given the way her parents look different than she does. So all these are excellent suggestions, memories of friends, memories of relatives, that sort of thing. And I'm not discounting any of your answers. I think they're good. But what I want you to do now is dig deeper. Don't type your answer in the chat, but think about the most horrible, traumatic thing you could think of that could have happened to this girl in her backstory. Because remember, it's fiction. We're not actually harming a human being in the process of traumatizing them in this exercise. Think about the most awful thing that you could think of in Jenna's past. All right, everybody have something in their mind? Don't tell me yet. All right, hold it in your mind and then take a deep breath, and I want you to make it worse. Think of one little detail that could make it worse. All right, is there anyone who wants to share what they came up with, either in the chat or by coming on mic?
May I?
Yes, please, go ahead.
God forgive me for this.
It's just fiction. It's okay here.
Was absolute shit. And one of the caretakers was a pedophile and a rapist. And she either witnessed that caretaker doing something or had something done to her, but she was so young she couldn't put it into words and whatnot. And so as an older girl, she doesn't remember it, but it follows her around and so on.
That's excellent. Now, and I'm seeing some other really, really good answers in the chat too. Animals don't judge. Makes so much sense that she would bond with somebody who would not judge her or abuse her. You don't have to share in your fiction these terrible things that you make up for your character's backstory. You can keep them in mind for yourself and use them to help make decisions for your character about how they would behave, about how they would address or react to a certain situation without ever revealing where it came from. Now, often in fiction, and we're going to talk about this in a moment about the character, how the character changes over time. Often in fiction, we have characters working through a past trauma that they have to master or overcome or heal in order to come out victorious on the other side. And so for some of you, this really horrible thing that you did to your character in their backstory, maybe that becomes central, or maybe it doesn't. There's no requirement there. But by creating a trauma in your character's past, even if you don't share it, by creating that trauma, you enrich your character's details, their humanness, if you will. And you give yourself more material to work with so that you can be internally consistent in your story. Now, I know that we as human beings are not always internally consistent. For example, I was attacked viciously by a dog when I was 10 years old. And yet I have a service dog and I work with dogs all the time, and dogs are a really, really important part of my life, both in physicality and emotionally. But so those two things might not seem to connect, right? They may not be they might seem internally consistent, that I had this horrific traumatic event in my backstory, but on page 1, I don't seem to be affected by it. Oftentimes, if you dig deeper, you can find that there's some connective tissue there. For me, I still have a fear of German Shepherds because that's the kind of dog that attacked me. So even though I've overcome that and I can be around German Shepherds, when I foster service dogs and when I choose service dogs for myself, I exclude German Shepherds from the pool because I'm afraid that there may be something inside me that will not let me bond as much with that dog because it's a German Shepherd, or perhaps that animal may pick up on my reticence or my residual fear. So it does all connect. And I'm not telling you that for your characters, everything has to be very, very linear and connect, because as humans, that's not what we're like. But thinking about these things, thinking about what traumas you're going to give your character and how it ripples through their lives, how it affects them as the page 1 character, can be very, very enriching for you as a writer and for your work. And extrapolating from that for your readers who experience your characters and your worlds. So please, even though you love your characters and you don't want to hurt them, if you traumatize them, your characters and your story will be richer for it. So be sure to traumatize your characters, including maybe especially your villains. Okay, so we're gonna move along to our next topic to make sure we have time for everything. Thank you for your participation, everyone. I'm gonna ask you to participate again in a little bit. But we're gonna do a quick aside here about naming. Naming was not on our list of topics, but naming is near and dear to my heart. And I wanna do just a little aside about naming your characters while we're on the topic of character. The main advice I have about naming is for you to put some thought into it. Even though it might not make or break your story, names can be very, very important. You could just phone it in, but why not take a little extra time to make naming your characters an important part of your story, or at least important part of your prep. And I think it'll help make your stories shine. Some tools for naming. Just to share how I usually do it, I come up with, typically for my main characters, first, middle, and last name, unless they're in a world where that is not something that they have, because I do write under the umbrella of speculative fiction. I write science fiction and fantasy, so it's conceivable that not every character would have that convention. But I also want to mention I like to give a nickname to at least one of my characters, if not more. You don't want to put too much seasoning in the stew. Like you don't want to have everybody have a nickname and the readers are having to track their real name, their first name, their last name, their nickname, all those things. You don't want to make it too complex. But I like to put a little seasoning in the story and have at least one character, one of the main characters, have a nickname, because that's kind of a natural thing that we encounter in real life. Other things I take into consideration when I name a character, their gender. And nowadays, I don't just look at male, female, but I look at non-binary. And for under the umbrella of speculative fiction, there might be a gender that we don't have in our contemporary America. I look at ethnicity. I look at etymology of the name. I look at connotations that I personally have with the name. Those may not be important to a reader, but for me, if the kid who bullied me in elementary school was named Jason, I probably am not going to feel like the name Jason is befitting of my hero. Maybe I'll use that to name a villain. So be aware of your personal connections to names. You might also take a look at what connotations other people have for your name in popular culture, and just people that you know. So when I was getting ready to name a villain, I had this name in mind, and I put my name out to a focus group, a test group of readers. And I said, you know, what do you think about the name Jordan for a villain? And I don't even think I said for a villain. I just said, what do you think about the name Jordan? And I got all sorts of impressions. Somebody who's smart, somebody who's an upstanding guy, somebody who's your brother's best friend, like all these things. And I went, holy cow, this doesn't sound like a villain at all. So impressions of the name Jordan didn't really lend themselves toward being a villain, at least in that focus group that I talked to. But once you have a character in popular culture like Freddie or Damien, who is a villain, then those names tend to carry that essence of it with them. So think about popular culture, maybe do some test groups. It doesn't have to be super scientific, but just take the pulse. I mentioned etymology. I think about the meaning of a name in English, as well as any other language that might be important. I think about the era of my story. If my story takes place in the real world, is it happening today? Is it happening 100 years ago? Is it happening in one locale, one country versus another? It can really matter as to what name you choose if you want it to be authentic. I also think about the genre of the story, because you'll often see in certain genres that you have certain naming trends. In fantasy works, you'll often get very long, seemingly unpronounceable names. So look at your genre and see what conventions there might be there. I think about how the name sounds if I say it out loud. If how it sounds is important to me, I make sure that the spelling reflects how I want it to sound phonetically or traditionally in a reader's mind. I also look at how it looks on the page and how it works with other characters' names. I'll give you an example. In my first novel, which is unpublished, I had my protagonist was named Carrie, Carrie, Carrie. And one of the other characters was the trickster, Coyote. Well, Carrie, spelled that way, and Coyote, they both start and end with the same letter and have the same number of letters and have very much the same footprint on the printed page. So when I would read my work, I would sometimes confuse them, which meant that my readers would probably fall prey to that as well. So I ended up changing Carrie's name so that it didn't compete with Coyote. So think about how the names you choose work in conjunction with other characters. In my published novels, I've kept, as I'm writing, I've kept a list alphabetically of character names. In my post-apocalyptic, I have well over 100 named characters, and it can be very, very difficult for a reader to grasp onto those names and keep those characters separate. So I made sure that I spread the names across the alphabet so that I didn't have everybody starting their name starting with the letter J, which tends to be one of my go-tos. And I also looked at some ethnicities. Like I have a group of people that are descended from Russian submariners. So they have more Russian sounding names, for example. So do your best with your naming to please not only yourself, but your reader, and make things consistent for your reader with your world, and make it easy for them to follow who's who, rather than, oh, that's the C character's name that I can't pronounce. Oh, and there's another C character, but it looks a little different. Which one of them had an X in it? Make it easier for your reader. We want it to be a positive, easy experience for them to dive into your story and then stay on the raft as you take them down the river. Lots of ways you can find names. You can look at existing names. There's lots of baby name websites. There are listed on your naming section of your handout, just a few of them. There are also name generators. There are fantasy name generators, all different kinds of name generators. I went into one of the name generators and I came up with this really cool name. Where did I write it down? Thorold St. John. Thorold St. John. I never would have thought of that on my own, but that name generator gave me what could be an amazing name for somebody in a fantasy world. You can also make up names yourself. One of my favorite ways to do that is by taking common beginnings of normal common names and common endings of normal names, and then mixing and matching. So Conry is a good example. Conry isn't necessarily a real name that you'll find in a baby naming book, but it feels like it could be a real name because con is common as the beginning of a name, and re or ray is common as an ending of a name. So mix and match. I also like to watch for typos when I'm writing because some really cool stuff can come up, especially for a fantasy writer. Laura might become Lort, L-A-U-R-T. Oh, that's kind of a cool name. You can also purposely make a typo by moving your fingers like one key off of home row. And if you type the word Laura with your hands misplaced, you get Kara. Oh, Kara is a really cool name. Another way is to look at place names. Now, I know it's really, really common today for parents to name their children after places like Montana. Well, pick a place that you haven't ever heard of somebody naming their kid, like Manitou or Visalia. You can also use words that are not commonly used in English as names, like score, plaid, pale, otter. Paying attention to all of the above considerations, of course. And however you do it, whatever combination of these things you do, or your own way of researching and making stuff up, please, for the sake of your readers, or just for my sake, put some effort into it. Naming is one of my favorite things, and I think it's really, really important, and I probably have spent way too long on it. If you're interested in nonfiction book on naming next year, and I've said that for several years in a row now, but I'm pretty confident next year, my next nonfiction book for writers will come out. It's called 52 Ways to Name a Character. So stay tuned on my website for that if you are interested in naming. Okay, moving on to character arc, what I promised I would cover. And that is our last topic for today before we get to your questions. Character arc, as I mentioned earlier, is the growth or change in a character over the course of a story. It is not the things that happen in a story, that's plot. Character arc is what happens on the inside of a character, their internal change. Now, we talked a little bit about the hero's journey earlier, the different points along that monomyth. Those points that we talked about, the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, the meeting of the mentor, those are all plot points. Lucky for us, there is a corresponding chart called the hero's inner journey that provides the character's internal change, each one corresponding to one of the plot points on the hero's journey, monomyth. So this is how a character grows or changes inwardly over the course of a story. Now, you don't have to use this, obviously. And if you use a different monomyth, like the heroine's journey, or another monomyth that I haven't supplied for you yet, but my homework is to find one, you can look for, or if all else fails, make up the progression of the internal journey of the character yourself. You may remember when we talked about scene and sequel. Scene is something that happens, and sequel is your character's reaction to it. This is that same thing. Yet again, you have external, internal. You have scene and sequel. You have plot, you have character arc, how the character changes internally throughout the story. Here is your last interactive exercise. Do these characters change? Hopefully one of them is familiar to you. And an aside I forgot to give you earlier, you'll notice that I use movies a lot when talking about writing novels. Why would I do that? Well, there are so many, many, many more novels out there than movies. I might pick one that is really important to me, and you might never have heard of it. So people who teach fiction writing often will rely on movies that are well known in popular culture because they're more familiar to more people in the audience. So go ahead and type in the chat, pick one of these characters that is familiar to you. Hopefully you find one. Someone said that they only know Shrek here. For you, Jennifer, type in the chat if you would like. How do you think Shrek changes over the course of that first movie? If you know Minority Report, you can pick Anderton, Ripley from Alien, Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind, or Tootsie, Dustin Hoffman's character definitely changes inwardly. This is about, looks like it's about an outward change, but his character changes inwardly in a very significant way. Go ahead and type in the chat if you would like to share your ideas for how a character might change. I'll go ahead and talk about Shrek since that's familiar to a couple of you. Shrek has a standard but really well executed character arc. Shrek, on his page 1 character, is tired of rejection, doesn't want to be rejected anymore. To keep it from happening, he hides out in the swamp and he scares away everybody who visits him until one day someone won't stay away. And in the process of the story, Shrek changes on the inside and it becomes the classic reluctant hero. So Sim is saying she doesn't think that Scarlett and Shrek really change. That is definitely open to interpretation, and we are going to talk in a moment about characters who don't change at all, because some protagonists in popular fiction don't change. Some characters change in a very, very small way, where it's just sort of a tweak on who they used to be. Some characters are who they really are on the inside, and it's only bringing that to the forefront that appears to be a change to the viewer or the reader, so you could argue they don't really change. For Scarlett O'Hara, some people say it's a very pronounced character arc, that she starts out as a flighty young girl and ends as a strong and determined woman. But whether she had that strong and determined woman in her from the beginning, maybe it's a matter of semantics. But in the process of going from page 1 through this journey all the way to the end, it is very satisfying for us as consumers of fiction to see a character evolve, grow, improve, and change. And I'm looking now at what Hans has written about Minority Report, and yes, he does go, Anderton, Tom Cruise's character, does go through a really significant change. in the way that he looks at this modern world. He thinks it's such a great thing, and he comes to learn that it's maybe not such a great thing. And he also has some healing in the course of the story about the death of his own child and the death of his marriage. And again, it's very, I think, satisfying to readers to see characters who change. So think about your character and how they might change, or maybe embrace a part of themselves that they already have that are hiding, and bring that to the forefront by the end of their story. But not every story has a protagonist that changes. These are some examples of characters I would argue don't really change in a fundamental way. Now, it's important to realize that characters who don't have a character arc, it doesn't mean that nothing happens in the story. And it doesn't mean that the character doesn't think about what happens to them and react emotionally or process emotionally those things that are happening. They still have goals, things that get in their way, and they meet up with opposition, and they still process those things. But while they may learn things and feel things, the difference here is that these protagonists don't undergo a fundamental personal change in order to defeat the antagonist or solve the problem. For example, Clarice in Silence of the Lambs, I see that Hans has shared with us, the lambs are no longer screaming, they are silent. My interpretation of that is Clarice is not transformed as a human being, as a character. She's wiser, she's learned things, but she's not fundamentally a different person as she processes through what is happening. You could say that about a lot of our superhero characters as well. Something to think about, though, when you write a character who doesn't appear to change from page 1 to the last page of a novel, you can think about them changing in the course of a series. I would argue that the Bond character does have an arc. When you go back to his origin story here about what made him Bond, there is an arc there. You'll find a similar arc, I believe, in the Travis McGee mystery novels over the course of the entire series. You might argue that the Outlander novels are working in a similar way. So if you're writing a series and you have a main character that doesn't really change, or a character who does change, either way, you can sort of look at that meta arc over the course of a series as to how that character might change from the beginning of the series to the end of the series. So that was character arc in a nutshell. We've covered a whole lot of information today. We've talked about story ideas, genre, story structure, plotting and planning, or pantsing. We've talked about character creation and the importance of a character, the importance of having characters in your stories that readers can latch onto and see the story through their eyes and emotionally connect with your story. We talked a little bit about naming, one of my favorite topics. And finally, character arcs. Now you'll see that there's a whole lot more information that we have yet to cover next Saturday. And I promise I will definitely get to all of those other topics next Saturday. But for today, in the time we have left, I'd like to answer questions that I didn't get to from earlier, and any new questions that you may have, or comments, things that you want to share about building characters and the other topics we've covered today. So if anybody wants to come on mic and camera, I'll go ahead and open that up so that we
can read the questions. I saved them that were from before.
Great.
The first one was from Selena, and she asked, how often do you recommend working on your novel? I have trouble consistently working on my piece.
That's a really good question. And any questions you have about sort of the writer's life and that sort of thing, I'm more than happy to answer from my own perspective, and also from the perspective of working in this community for the past 30 years. Some people will tell you that to be a real writer, you must write every day. You must exercise that muscle and write something, anything every day. Well, I think that's crap. But I bought into it for a long time. I thought, oh, I'm not a real writer if I don't write every day. I need to, change my habits. I need to make myself do this. And I did try it. And it didn't work really well for me at that time in my life, at that stage of my career. Writing every day in a forced way just didn't work for me. I found that I like to work in binges, kind of like you would binge watch a series all in one sitting. I liked to clear my day and make sure that I had it free of other interruptions and focus on my writing for 8 hours in one day. Well, that doesn't work for everybody, but it worked for me. And then later I progressed in my career to a point where I had deadlines such that I had to write pretty much every day. So now what I do is every morning I have several hours, at least 1 hour that I clear of other interruptions. And I make sure that my mom and my kids all know that that is my writing time. And I turn off social media and I turn off my phone ringer and all of that. And I focus on my writing every weekday morning. Weekends are reserved for family unless I'm under a really tight deadline. Some days I binge and I write more than an hour. I write 8 hours. Other times I put in my time, I get a little closer to my goal and then I move on to other things like marketing or life. So I would recommend that you try to find a pattern, a repeatable pattern that works for you. If you leave it to, I will write when I find time, or I will write when I find inspiration, you might not write very often. But if you figure out what life pattern works for you best and you actually block time on your calendar, then you will build a habit that works for you. I talk a lot more about this in another workshop that I did for Pikes Peak Library District on NaNoWriMo. And there are recorded classes on YouTube that you can find through the library when I talk about setting up your life for writing to be a regular thing. So did I answer that question?
If I may,
Sure.
can I throw something in?
Of course.
There's also a book called Bird by Anne Lamont. When I was writing a lot, that book saved my life because she goes through the different styles of writing, be it binging or writing every day and whatnot. And it's basically this short little guide about how to do those things without driving yourself or your family completely insane.
That's a great resource. And you'll find a lot of books out there like that. That one might even be on my resource list that talk about how to build habits and how to set up your life to be a regular writer, regularity being the key, and finding a pattern that works personally for you. Thank you for sharing that, Sin.
You're welcome.
All right, next question, Melissa. Do we have some more from the past? You're muted right now.
Yes, I was trying to get myself unmuted. You think after doing this for a year, it'd be second nature. But yes, there is another question from David, and he asked, is there a trick to writing about something consumers want to actually read? It's the age-old question of, are you writing merely because you are an artist and want to create, whether it be painting, writing, making a movie, or are you writing to create something popular with the goal of making a lot of money? Can you blend both of those things? Can you make
that's
art?
A good question. It's a really good question, and it is an age-old question. It's a question that anybody who wants to sell their work finds themselves asking themselves. Do I write to a trend? Do I write to market? Do I try to figure out what publishing houses are buying and try to supply that? Nowadays, with being able to self-publish, more and more writers are able to look at market trends, write to market, and publish in very quick succession. Whereas if you're trying to game the system and publish through one of the big 5 publishers or any sort of trad or traditional press, the machine of publishing doesn't move fast enough. to really write to market in that way, typically. But if you're self-publishing, you could certainly try it. I know people who've been very successful figuring out what an audience wants and giving it to them. For example, lit RPG genre, which is fiction that's like adventure fiction based in a it's a role-playing game type of story. So lit RPG is one of those marketplaces where people are writing to market and they're making a ton of money doing it. I look at it from a different perspective. I mean, certainly because I want to sell my books, I want to provide a story that somebody else wants to read. But if I look at it like I'm a human, I'm a reader, things that are interesting to me, I would think would be interesting to someone else in the world. Now, it might only be 3 other people, or it might be thousands of people. You don't really know. But if you write something that is important to you, and you really give yourself to it, and you make it a good product, then I would like to think that someone else in the world is going to resonate with that because it's authentic, right? We resonate with stories that are authentic. So I would say there are definitely different ways to go about this, and you'll find different authors say different things. That's just my take on it. All right, do we have some more questions? I know we're coming up on time here, but I am willing to stay as long as you all are here and as long as Melissa will host us.
Oh, there's no other questions from earlier. So,
all right, do we have any new questions in the chat here?
Let's see. I don't see any new questions at all.
Well, if any of you would like to ask another question in the couple minutes we have, I would love to hear.
I have one.
Okay.
May I?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm kind of a closet writer because crap scares me. And I've been in a situation where what?
Because craft scares you?
Well, because everything scares me.
I love that you're honest. I was just trying to, I didn't hear what you said the first time, so.
Yeah. I write, but I'm one of those desk drawer writers, so I'm a complete chicken shit. Yeah, writing makes me pee my pants in fear it's bad. And when I have published, I have had 2 major problems. One, because I write about stuff that is very specific to identities of me or some of my close friends. The wider population doesn't get it. And I don't know how to bridge that gap. I suck at that. But the other one that is even bigger is that I have made the acquaintance, unfortunately, in my life with trolls. Do you know what I mean when I say troll?
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, I do. And I think that those 2 things really probably work synergistically for you and may get in the way of you putting your work out in front of people. Yep. Trolls are, in the modern world of social media, they're a bigger problem because it's easier for people who want to troll you or harass you or give you a hard time. It's easier for them to reach you. I'm sure back in the day, Shakespeare had hecklers. I'm sure back in the day, Mark Twain had people who wrote him letters and said they thought what he did was crap. There are always people out in the world who are going to dislike what you do or dislike who they think you are as a person based on what you present to the public. And I think that, we could psychoanalyze and say that, oh, they're mean or they don't like you because of some problem in their life. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. What matters is in today's very connected digital world, it's easy for trolls to get to you.
Right.
And there are definitely protections that you can put in place in the physical world, but I think that where we as writers really need to look at building protections is in our emotional world, so that we don't have these bad things that happen to us in the real world inhibit our creativity and our ability to write stories and to be brave and put the stories out in public. So those are probably bigger questions that you would need to look into, either on the physical or the emotional side, or both. In terms of being super critical of your own work, being afraid of getting something wrong, being afraid of writing things that maybe only resonate with 2 other people, I would say that each of us has our own demons of perfectionism or feelings of inadequacy that we deal with. And those things can make our writing richer if we let them. So if you know that you have some emotional or psychological or historical issue that you're grappling with, and you feel brave enough to grab it head on and take a look at it, sometimes doing that, sometimes addressing the fear can help us get past it. And I know a lot of writers talk about putting those things in their stories. So something like fear of being bullied, fear of not being accepted, fear of being called out as different or bad. Those are universal things that lots of other human beings can relate to. So if your character, even though your character is differently abled or differently oriented, if they share those universal emotional fears and concerns, then other people who maybe don't look like them or don't have the same shared history can still relate to them. And I would say that your topics and issues that you're addressing are really timely. And if you can find a way to be brave and let them out into the world, if you're authentic and honest about it, then I think other people will see you, they'll hear you, and they'll relate to what you're saying, because the underlying essence is universal. Unfortunately, I can't promise you that your work will be met with critical acclaim. Your work could be met with a lot of criticism, literary criticism, bad reviews, trolls.
Friends of mine, yeah.
Yeah, I can't promise you how the world will receive it, but you can only do what is in your power to control. And I hope that you find a way to be brave and share your stories. Because if you don't, if people don't find a way to share what is in their hearts and is really significant to them and pivotal to them, then how do we connect as a community through story? How do we grow if we don't see what other people are doing in story? So I'm a big fan of encouraging you to put it out there.
Thank you.
Sure. Do we have some other questions here?
There's a couple more questions. Deborah has one. I'll let you read it because it's in the chat.
Deborah says, I get caught in research trying to find specifics. For example, not when women became FBI agents long ago, but when did women become integral to FBI? When were they coming online and being mentored? This is an example. She tried to find out about old railroads, and it was frustrating. How do you go about that? And time is an element. All right, so research, it's a big deal for me. I do lots and lots of research. That's part of how I explore my ideas and how I form my ideas and my stories. And I confess that it's a rabbit hole I fall down and get lost in. I think that I'm not going to tell you researching is wrong. I think researching is a fantastic way to get to know your subject. I think that I need to find a way to be forgiving of myself for not knowing everything about everything. So I try to limit my expectations of myself, that I'm not going to become an expert in, say, coronal mass ejection physics, which is part of my book Seeds, but I can ask other experts. Recently, I had something in one of my books. I can't remember what it was now, that I double checked with people who I thought would be experts and would know. I had a short story published a couple years ago, and I had emergency services show up at the house of a dead person. And I wanted to make sure I got that right. Like, what are the protocols? And so I asked people who were experts who I thought would know. So one way of being brave and letting the research go and just moving on with the writing is, when you're done with your project, have beta readers, have subject matter experts read it and make sure that you don't have anything egregious. And also, like I did with the physics, you can consult experts in advance of writing to make sure that your foundations are on solid ground there. In terms of time, what I would recommend, if you are prone to falling down the rabbit hole of research or any other thing that tends to take you away from writing words on the page, this goes for everybody. Your timer is your friend. Set a timer for 20 minutes, an hour, however long you feel like you can allow yourself to fall down a rabbit hole and explore something. And when the timer goes off, you're done researching for that moment, for that day. I think having the timer going not only helps you feel like, okay, I'm going to have a stopping point, I'm not going to get lost, but it makes you, I think, more focused in the time that you have, because you know that time is limited. So maybe you do a more efficient job. So those are my answers for research and the challenge of time. Right. We have another question from Selena. She said, you mentioned trad and indie publishing. What has been your experience with either, both methods? Do you have any tips? Yes, and we are going to talk a little bit more in our next class about what you do when your novel's done. For me, I spent quite a long time, many years, pursuing a traditional publishing contract, which meant that I was submitting my work to agents and to editors, and I was pitching to agents and editors at live events. That's where you go and you sit down and you have like a very short meeting with somebody who has the power to buy your book, and you talk about it. So I did a lot of that. And I eventually decided that I was going to set that aside and I was going to self-publish. And once I made that decision, as the fates would have it, I had a publisher come to me and say that they believed in my book, they believed in my work, and they wanted to publish my book. With Seeds, my first published novel, the problem I was having with it was it wasn't meeting certain market requirements. I'll tell you the specific one that I failed to meet, and that is most trad buyers, publishers buy your work, agents represent you, difference in semantics there, but most of those authorities in the traditional world, they will not pick up a brand new author who is unpublished, whose book is over 100,000 words. That may have changed in recent years, but I kind of doubt it. It's a risk when they take on an author who doesn't have a known audience, and they put that much time and money into a big fat book over 100,000 words. Even when it meets the market requirements, that it's a fantasy or a science fiction novel that tends to be longer, first-time authors have a really hard time getting picked up for an extra long book. Seeds was 140,000 words. I tried cutting it down. I tried really hard. I had a traditional publisher who was interested, who said if I could cut it down, that they would want to talk to me about a contract. But I spent all this time cutting, and I just couldn't do it. And eventually this publisher, Parker Hayden Media, that came to me through an organization that we're both part of, when the editor got a hold of my book, she said, you need to add all that stuff back. Like the stuff that you cut out, we need that back. You cut out stuff that's important. You cut out stuff that helps readers connect with your characters, and we need that. So they eventually published Seeds as I think it's around 140,000 words, which for a standalone post-apocalyptic is not unusual in the marketplace. But I couldn't overcome the hurdle of traditional big five publishers to publish it. So my experience with that is mixed. My subsequent books have all been through Parker Hayden Media, and they are a micro press. So a lot of what I'm doing is self-published, sort of. It's indie published, sort of. Like, I don't pay them to take care of my books. Like if you're a true indie, you would pay someone to edit your books, and you would format them yourself or pay for it yourself. I don't do that. I'm under contract. And when you're under contract with a publisher, the money should flow to the author, not away from the author. It's a really good rule of thumb. If you are under contract with the publisher, the money flows to you, not away from you. So in that sense, I have a traditional publisher, but in a lot of other senses, I don't, because they're very small and I do a lot of my own marketing and that sort of thing. So in terms of tips for success, know the market, research the business side of being an author, and figure out, do you want to learn all the ins and outs of how to get a cover done, get your book edited, get your book formatted, get your book in front of the right people, get it uploaded to Amazon and Kobo and Barnes and Noble, and deal with all of that side of things? Or would you rather somebody else do that for you? And in exchange, you're giving up a lot of control of your own product if somebody else is doing that for you. And you're giving up a lot of money. If your book makes a lot of money, the publisher takes a big chunk of it. The publisher also gets your book out in front of more people. So maybe you only get, 10% or 20% of that book, or 5% or whatever it is, but you sell so many more books that 5% of a traditionally published book is more money than 100% of an indie published book, because it doesn't go to as many people. There's a lot there to unpack. There's a lot of information that goes into making the decision if you want to go trad or if you want to go indie. And a lot of authors flip-flop between them or do a hybrid. So there isn't a clean answer, even for any one person at any moment in time. So do your research, talk to other writers like you're asking me, ask questions, figure out what it is you really want out of the process and what you're willing to put into the process. And that will lead you closer to a decision about what you want to do. I wish I had a more traditional path to share with you, but many other authors do. And I'm sure you could find a lot of stories out there about how different people have gotten to where they are.
Well, and if I could add just a little something, a lot of times those big five publishers will look at indie stuff and will choose people that have done really well in indie in some way to go further, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not necessarily just choosing one or the other. As
with an author like Hugh Howey, who maybe somebody who you're referring to, Sin, Hugh Howey was very, very, very successful publishing indie. And he then was sought out by the Kristen Nelson Literary Agency, who then contracted with him to do like his print books in foreign countries and his film rights and things like that. So what I did when Seeds had a big spike of success when it first came out, I thought, whoa, this is really good. I've made all these sales and I have all these rankings and all these ratings and everything is so great. I contacted a friend of mine at the Kristen Nelson Literary Agency. And I said, when does an indie book catch your interest? Like, is my success, which I thought was pretty rockin', is that even a blip on your radar? And she basically said, no, it was not a blip on her radar. That if you're looking at big publishers or big literary agencies who want to take your existing success and help you build on it, you have to be pretty darn successful in order to get their attention. So I don't want to burst your bubble, because what you're saying, Sin, is correct. That does happen, but I want to manage expectations that for that to happen, lightning must strike, or you must be very, very successful as an indie to catch their attention. And in that case, if you're very, very successful as an indie, really think about, what are you giving up by partnering with a big publisher at that point? What are you gaining and what are you losing? Because if they're coming to you because they think you're a moneymaker, they're probably coming to you because they think they can make money with you, which means maybe you're making less, maybe you're making more, who knows? So think about those things. And thank you for sharing your experience with that.
Thank you both.
I hope that did answer your question, Selena. Selena, how do you, Selena.
I'm Selena. I'm Selena.
Thank you, Selena.
Traditional family spelling.
Okay. Do we have any more questions before we sign off for today?
There's nothing in the chat.
Well, I want to thank you all. Oh, Hans did have a question about, I'm so sorry I missed that, Hans. Let me scroll back and find it.
Oh.
I'm sorry, Hans, but I don't see it. Could you paste it back?
He said, I'm halfway through my second book. I have the rest planned out, but I no longer believe in it. Help.
I will try to help you. This may be beyond my ability to help, because if you don't believe in something, you have to ask yourself, is it worth trying to reestablish that belief, or is it better to move on? And I can't answer that question for you. I will tell you that most writers who write longer works like novels, most of us at some point in the process get to a point where it just doesn't feel like the right path anymore. We don't believe in it, or we are tired of it, we're burnt out, we're bored with it, whatever it is. And that doesn't mean that it's not a viable, worthwhile project. It just may mean that you have reached a point of exhaustion or saturation or whatever it is, that you're not able to see the path forward. So in those cases, I always recommend taking a break. Whatever you do, don't throw it out, don't delete it or burn it. Hang on to it, because you may find that with a fresh perspective, you can believe in it again. Since you are on your second book, I don't know if this is your second book in a series. It's what it kind of sounds like to me. Could you go ahead and let me know in the chat if, Hans, if that is it's a sequel? Okay, so here's what I would recommend, and I would recommend this to all of you out there. Make sure that your first book is really what it needs to be in the marketplace before you invest your time in writing a sequel. Because if you write a first book that isn't easily classified in a genre, that isn't easy to find its audience, that isn't really, connecting, then writing a sequel might be a waste of your time. If no one is going to read the first book, then your sequel, sure, it's an exercise in getting better as a writer, but if your goal is to sell, it's better to make sure your first book is right before you write a sequel. What I did with Seeds is it was a complete standalone, and I ended it where there was no sequel possible. But in looking at the marketplace, I realized that if it hits really big, if it becomes a movie, if it does XYZ, then I might want to have the door open for a sequel. Because last year before the pandemic hit, when I was talking to a movie producer, which was super weird and exciting, I was talking to him about my book Quake. One of the very first things he asked me is, how many books are there in the series? Have you written the end? Like how does it work? A lot of publishers and a lot of producers will want there to be a sequel. So if you haven't written the sequel, it's nice to make sure that the sequel is possible. In the case of Seeds, even though it hit pretty big and is actually still doing pretty well, like on Kobo, I haven't written the sequel because I didn't feel like it really met a big enough audience. And I also felt like I had improved a lot as a writer by the time I got done writing Seeds, and I wanted to bring those skills to bear on a new project. With Quake, I had a market for sequels. And so I did publish Quake, then Shake, and now Break is coming out later this year. And it was a different scenario than it was with Seeds. Seeds, I haven't gone back to write the sequel, although I still could. I'm not sure if that's totally what I was meant to answer there. So Hans is saying with his first book that it was what Hans wanted it to be, but it doesn't seem to be finding an audience. So my recommendation to you then would be to set book 2 aside. Set it aside, don't burn it, but set it aside and try another project and see if that gets you back in the groove and back believing in yourself.
And also, sorry, I'm a chatterbox, may I?
Go ahead, yes.
Let's say that you're right, Hans, and the book objectively sucks. It's what you want it to be, but it viscerally, objectively is garbage, like is crap, you know? Let's say that you're absolutely right for thought experiment purposes, right? You can kill it and you can autopsy that sucker. Rip the characters to shreds, pull the plot out, put characters in a different timeline, bury what's dead. If anything is even remotely alive, organ transplant that thing. You know what I mean? Like, as our teacher has said throughout this entire talk, you're not married to any of this. You are God in this scenario. So if the thing viscerally absolutely sucks, don't be precious about it. Kill it and rip it to shreds.
and learn from it. Dissect it and learn from it. But move on. So that was one of the things that my critique group convinced me to do when I had spent many, 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 many years writing a book that I wanted to be first in series. And I had subsequent books outlined, and I had written and rewritten and revamped and edited and rewritten and over again this novel. They finally said, you know what? We think maybe you've done all you can do here, and that you would benefit from a change in perspective. You would benefit from taking what you've learned and how you've grown as a writer, and instead of applying it to something old that you have all kinds of baggage with, try something new. And so I did, and it was terrible. And I didn't know if it was the right decision. And I went back and forth about, do I go back to the original novel? Do I go blah, blah, blah? And eventually I just realized that my second project wasn't the right project for me. And I started on what became Seeds. And I believe that Seeds is far and above better than my unpublished novel, The Rememberer. And then I think that Quake is better than Seeds. And so what I'm trying to do now is wrap up the trilogy, wrap up Break, that I'm under contract for. And when that's done, I have a very exciting new idea for a whole new character and a whole new world and a whole new everything that I will move on to and bring my skills to bear on that, how I've improved, and hopefully it'll be even better. All right, guys, I fear we have gone over quite a bit. So I will ask that if you think of more questions, you can always contact me through my website, chrismandeville.com. There's a contact button. I am not so famous that my email goes to someone else. I will see your email and I will respond to you. I meant what I said about this being a community. We're now all part of this community together. I so appreciate Sin and others of you sharing your thoughts and ideas. This isn't all about what I have to say. I love sharing ideas with you all, and I hope to continue to connect with you all at the next Saturday's class. Melissa, if there's anybody who is not yet signed up for both classes, would you be sure to reach out to them and make sure they know how to get signed up for next Saturday, so you'll get the link? And also, Melissa, are you able to get the handout out to people if I get it to you today?
Yes, I was going to ask you to go ahead and email it to me, and I should be able to get to it sometime today.
Okay, yeah, I know you're not at the library. So yeah, so the handout is a 4-page list of resources broken out by category, some of which we covered today and some of which we'll cover next Saturday. So I look forward to seeing, I hope, all of you next Saturday.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at M Mitchell, so MMITCHELL at ppld.org. And otherwise, we will see you next week. Have a good Saturday
Thanks,
and
everybody.
Sunday.
Thank you
Bye.
very much, Chris.